There's nothing like a good old smackdown by Bernie Sanders to start the weekend. Am I right? Yeah, I think I'm right. Earlier this week, Senator Bernie Sanders, who is a member of the Senate Budget Committee, was one of the senators who questioned Defense Undersecretary and Pentagon Comptroller David Norquist and John Gibson, the Defense Department's first chief management officer, doing a great job managing that place. But here's a little background on why the Senate Budget Committee is looking into the spending of the Department of Defense in the first place. If you watch this channel, at least a little, it's a bit obvious, but here's a quick summary. The Pentagon requested one of the largest budgets in history with its recent proposal of $686 billion and an additional $30 billion for non-defense agencies, including the Department of Energy, which maintains the country's nuclear weapons. For perspective, the U.S. allocates more money to the military than the next 10 highest spending countries combined. So that's a lot of dough for one department, especially when the United States is not in official, open, active war with any country. Yes, we are involved in multiple wars right now, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and a few more, but the United States in the past decade or so has pretty much stopped formally declaring war, and our involvement in these wars isn't what it was in the Korea War or the Vietnam War or the Gulf War or the Iraq and Afghanistan wars a few years ago. The great Representative Barbara Lee of California has been calling attention to this for many years. Yet, inexplicably, the Pentagon has requested one of the largest budgets in history. This is after a bombshell report came out from Politico that showed that the Pentagon lost track of $800 million recently. It just disappeared. Poof. They don't know how they spent it or where it went. They're not just demanding a huge budget when we're not formally at war. They've been proven to be insanely reckless with their already existing budget and are asking for more money. So that's part of what the Budget Committee was addressing here. Here is Senator Bernie Sanders asking the questions that I would want to ask, and I think that you guys would want to ask too.
The truth is, everybody supports the Department of Defense. We all support the men and women in the armed forces. But as I mentioned earlier, we are now spending more than the next 12 countries combined in defense. Against my vote, Congress just voted another $165 billion to go to the military. So here's the question. Who's our enemy? Who are we spending? Where we know that there are threats out there. All right, we're all aware of terrorism. But I think the amount of money that we're spending fighting ISIS, for example, is relatively small. Who are we preparing to go to war against or defend ourselves from?
Senator, the Secretary of Defense outlined in the National Defense Strategy the challenges that we face. Part of the emphasis in the strategy was the shift from a focus on terrorism to great power competition, with a particular emphasis on the long-term challenges of China and Russia. It refers to both of those as opportunities for peaceful competition, deterrence, and then the ability to prevail in a conflict should we have to. The strategy is both a classified and unclassified option, but it lays out and goes through the challenges that we face.
So we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars defending ourselves from China, while major corporation after major corporation is shutting down in the United States of America and moving to China. Anything incongruous about that?
So I think the White House and the President and others have talked about the competition expanding beyond defense. My expertise is more in the defense side.
That is what we call a smackdown. Per usual, Senator Sanders is correct, and the truth is that Congress did vote for another $165 billion to go to the military, but that doesn't even include overseas contingency operation funds, often referred to as the War Fund, which is around $60 billion on top of that. The Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO, fund, sometimes referred to as War Funds, is a separate pot of funding operated by the Department of Defense and the State Department in addition to their base budgets. Originally used to finance the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the OCO continues to be a source of funding for the Pentagon, with a fraction of the funds going to the State Department. Since the OCO fund has very little oversight and is not subject to the sequestration cuts that slashed every other part of the budget in 2013, many experts consider it a slush fund for the Pentagon. This was written a few years back. How much leeway can the Pentagon get? They are reckless with their money, we are not in open active war, and they have their own $60 billion slush fund on top of what they already get, which is a lot. And Senator Sanders is right that when compared to other countries, we spend infinitely more on defense. This is from last year. The United States spends more on defense than China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, the UK, Japan, and Germany combined, most of whom are our allies, by the way. Here's what we look like compared to many of our allies, analyzed by percentage of GDP. And why do we spend so much on defense, you may ask? Could it be that the United States has internalized American exceptionalism and has become a little bit paranoid about the rest of the world? Yeah, but that's just some of it. But you know what most of it is. Defense contractors and corruption. I'll let Bernie take it from here.
About half of the DoD budget goes to defense contractors. Is that roughly right? Okay.
That sounds about right, yes.
I think at the top of the list is Lockheed Martin.
That would be one of the top 5, absolutely.
Okay. Answer me this one. As I understand that, I'm looking at the revenue, 2016 defense revenues that went to Lockheed Martin is roughly $43 billion. And I'm just kind of curious, the CEO of that corporation received, what was it, $20 million? Over $20 million in compensation. Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, over 90% of the business was the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. In other words, we're giving this guy roughly an $18 million salary from the taxpayers of this country. Does that sound right to you? Is that something that we might want to look at and say when we give, I don't know what the salary is of the Secretary of Defense, what is it, $150,000, $200,000? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to you that we pay the Secretary of Defense $200,000 or less, and we give a contractor who gets 92% of his revenue from the taxpayer of this country $18 million of taxpayer money? Is that something that you might want to look at?
So I can't speak to how the companies compensate their executives. I know there may be rules on those, but they're outside my expertise. The one I can speak to, though, is that we do have, inside the office of the CFO, we have an organization that audits the contractors. So when they send us invoices and payments, we go through those in order to arm the contracting officers to make sure we're not being charged for.
But if I'm right, I got that. But right. If I am right, that over 90% of the revenue for a company comes from the taxpayers of this country, and this guy is making $20 million a year when the Secretary of Defense makes less than $200,000, I think that might be an issue that you might want to raise. All right? This is essentially, for all intent and purposes, Lockheed Martin is a government agency, if you like, private, but a government agency, virtually fully funded by the United States government.
Mm-hmm. Lockheed Martin. Let's take a look at them for a second. So Lockheed Martin spent over $13.6 million on lobbying in 2016, according to Open Secrets, which is the 15th most of any entity that is lobbying in the country. They increased their lobbying the following year, 2017, to over $14.4 million, also at number 15 when ranking. So to put that in perspective, being number 15 in lobbying as one singular company means you're pouring a lot of money in. The Chamber of Commerce is consistently the biggest lobbyist, but that's an association, as are many of the other top lobbyists that are above Lockheed Martin. Realtors associations and the pharmaceutical associations rank above it as well. So, as Bernie Sanders alluded to, CNBC reports, Marilyn Hewson, the CEO of Lockheed Martin, made nearly $20.6 million in 2016, according to Securities and Exchange Commission filings. A representative for Lockheed Martin did not immediately respond to CNBC's request for comment on Sanders' remarks. I wonder why they didn't respond. And lastly, I will end with this. In addition to Lockheed Martin and other contractors like Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman pocketing our taxpayer money, these defense bills boost their stocks. Take a look at the trajectory of Lockheed Martin stock from July of 2017 to February. The same for Boeing. Thank the spaghetti monster that we have someone like Senator Sanders calling this stuff out, because so many of our representatives are so clouded by cash that they just won't, and we need someone like him. This is important information, and I'm super glad he brought it to light.